Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, as we speak, David Cameron's arriving in Brussels for lunch with the EU Commission President. He's Jean-Claude Juncker. It comes amid reports today that Britain's apparently closing in on a deal that would allow it to deny in-work benefits to people from other parts of the EU for up to 4 years. But this idea comes with a so-called emergency brake, and it's met with scepticism from, well, I guess the clue's in the name, Eurosceptics. So what's on Mr Cameron's renegotiation shopping list? The Prime Minister said he wants 4 things for his shopping basket. First, economic governance. The PM wants safeguards to ensure countries like the UK that do not use the euro aren't disadvantaged. This includes not having to contribute to any future Eurozone bailouts. Second, competitiveness. The Prime Minister wants to extend the single market, cut red tape and ease the burden of excessive regulation. Third, sovereignty, which includes greater powers for national parliaments to block EU legislation and an opt-out from the EU's founding ambition in the Treaty of Rome to forge ever closer union. Fourth is the most specific and controversial. Ministers want to restrict in-work and some out-of-work benefits that can be claimed by EU migrants when they come here. Other EU countries say this is discriminatory. But reports today suggest that EU leaders could have offered Britain a new emergency brake rule. This could help curb immigration by denying benefits to new EU arrivals for 4 years. Former Tory Cabinet Minister John Redwood has already called this suggestion, quote, a sick joke and an insult to the UK. It's a reminder to the Prime Minister that even if you can get a deal agreed in time for the EU Council meeting next month in the middle of February, he still needs enough to satisfy Tory Eurosceptics already waiting for him at the checkout. Let's get more on this now with our Europe correspondent, Gavin Lee. Gavin, when this idea of an emergency brake was first used, the idea was an emergency brake to stop migration into Britain. Now it's being talked of as an emergency brake on welfare benefits. Is that right?
Yeah, basically it's a counter-proposal, Andrew. And in fact, David Cameron's just come through now for his Brussels lunch with Jean-Claude Juncker, who is basically the point man in this. The Commission have come up with this counter-proposal, this emergency brake, and basically on this fourth area that David Cameron is demanding change in Europe that's been put on paper, this idea of trying to curb migrant benefits for up to 4 years, in-work benefits, this is what it's in regard to. It's a variation on that theme. Remember, for weeks there's been a deadlock. Neither side saying that they would give ground, other member states saying actually it's an essential pillar of the EU, the idea of freedom to work and to live in any member state. This is something the Commission are putting forward, we understand, from a senior source who's told the BBC, who is close to negotiations. What it effectively means, Andrew, is that other member states get to look at the British position. Britain can apply for having this 4-year cap. They have to show that the welfare state simply cannot cope, and by a majority voting, other member states can agree to it. However, suddenly it's not the British only that have a special opt-out. All other member states can share the same emergency brake if they should need it. It isn't going to require treaty change. That's the other thing about how long it would take, given that there has to be a referendum between now and the end of 2017. It will be a lot more legislation, and in fact the source who explained how it would work to the BBC actually said in terms of legislation we're talking probably more than a treaty would take, but actually it's a better way of doing it. So that is what appears to be on paper, and in the past few minutes David Cameron's arrived here to start the very first of many talks with EU Commission and Parliament leaders here.
But can we just clarify, before any British government could apply this emergency brake on welfare payments, it would need a majority of European Union members. We'd need their permission before this emergency brake could be applied, and not to the number of migrants coming in, but to the kind of welfare they get once they're in. Is that right?
Yeah. As the proposal stands at the moment, it's not in the hands of Westminster. It's in the hands of Westminster to apply And that could happen, perhaps before the referendum. The talk could be that they could apply so David Cameron has something in place if the vote was to stay in Europe. And also that it has to be a majority approval by other member states. It would, at the moment as it stands, be for one time only. So if it's activated, it expires after that 4-year period. So this is all room for negotiation. The other thing to point out is the Commission are proposing this as a counter-proposal, we're told. The other member states aren't yet informed formally about this. The Polish foreign minister has said in the past half an hour that as Poland's concerned, they think this is a no-go. It's just not acceptable. So it might be for David Cameron this morning, who said on BBC Radio that he believes what was impossible on curbing benefit rights now seems to be possible. Other member states saying even for them to compromise, some would find it hard.
All right, listen, thank you very much for that instant to see what happens over lunch. See if Mr. Juncker has his usual brandy. Oh no, he has that for breakfast. Anyway, joining me now is the Eurosceptic Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan and John Springford from the Centre for European Reform. John Springford, isn't the idea that a British government would need the permission of a majority of EU members to do anything on welfare payments for migrants, isn't it so ludicrous that it has to be an Aunt Sally that the government can knock down and Mr. Cameron comes out and says, oh, I got a lot more than that?
Well, Andrew, I mean, the point of having a single market for labour is that workers can move around the single market and not be discriminated against by their host state. So it makes sense, if you think about it that way, that the European Union would decide whether a welfare system was being overwhelmed or not.
But couldn't we go now and ask, if we felt the welfare system was being overwhelmed, what would stop us under current European rules for going to ask a majority to change our rules?
There is no clear mechanism now under EU rules for them to be able to stop migrants from coming or from allowing them to have access for welfare.
No, I don't mean stopping, but if we went to the rest of the EU and got a majority vote allowing us to change some of our welfare rules for migrants, I don't understand why we couldn't do that at the moment.
Because there are rules in the treaty which underlies all of the legislation which the European Union creates, which make that kind of unilateral action
But it wouldn't be unilateral action if we went and got a majority to agree.
But even so, the European Court of Justice defends the treaties.
And so you think even if it was a majority agreed, it would breach the treaties. So what's being proposed as a step forward?
I don't think anyone believes that. I mean, we were talking about an emergency brake on migration, as you said. The Eurocrats said no. Then we talked about a complete ban on benefits. Eurocrats said no. Now we're saying, well, what about an emergency brake on the benefits? I mean, this is something that even the PM last year was saying was completely unacceptable. And you've got to ask the question, if this is how we are being treated now, if the Eurocrats are this unable to make any significant concession when their second largest economy is about to hold a referendum on leaving, imagine how they would treat us the day after we had voted to stay.
I think that cuts in another direction as well, which is if we vote to leave, and we have just tried to renegotiate our position, and we haven't, and it's true, I think Daniel's right, that we haven't necessarily really transformed our relationship with the EU, that they're unlikely to give us major concessions in the negotiations over Brexit and what kind of market access we're going to get.
But over Brexit, we would make up our own rules on what migrants got for welfare.
Not necessarily, because Norway or Switzerland, for example, they have to abide by free movement rules in order to have market access in other areas, in goods and in services.
I'm sure we would have sensible bilateral and multilateral deals as an independent country. I mean, no one is talking about withdrawing cooperation or involvement in the European continent. Post-Brexit, United Kingdom will remain interested and involved in the affairs of every continent, including Europe. But you've got to say, the PM, I suspect, is regretting that he ever went down this road of renegotiation. I suspect he'd have been better off just holding a snap-in-out referendum, because what he's done is to raise and dash expectations. And I think a lot of people will have looked at what's gone on and said, my goodness, there is the leader of the fifth largest economy of the world, touring foreign capitals, begging for the right to tweak his own welfare changes, and still being denied, right? That's not the leader of an independent country. And to repeat, if that's how we're being treated now, imagine if we'd run up the white flag and said, we're staying in. Imagine what's going to come down the line then. We know that the Eurocrats are proposing what they call a social union, which is the harmonisation of welfare and social entitlements across the continent. We know we'd be dragged into more bailouts. There is a far greater risk in voting to stay than in taking back control.
I mean, when you look at what's happening in Europe, the huge challenges that Europe currently faces, the Schengen now struggling to survive, border controls, even on the bridge between Copenhagen and Malmo. You can't get more symbolic than that. Nothing the Prime Minister is proposing would really make a blind bit of difference to any of that and Britain's relationship with it. There's some sense in saying just have a referendum on in or out, isn't there? Never mind. The renegotiations are de minimis.
And I agree. I agree with that. I mean, it seems to me to make the referendum about whether being in the EU is good for Britain's labour market, it's good for Britain's goods and services markets, or whether leaving is better.
It's a broader issue, isn't it? There's this. Who said that an emergency brake was, quote, some arcane mechanism which would probably be triggered by the European Commission and not by us?
Probably David Cameron.
Correct.
But the grand old Duke of Downing Street's marched himself to the top of the hill. He's marched himself down. He's not even halfway up now. And he's made a complete and utter hash of this. He would have laughed out this proposal. He would have laughed it out of court not so long ago. But he's desperate now. Whatever he gets in the next few weeks, he's going to hail it as the greatest deal ever, but we'll all know.
And they know that in Brussels.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Of course.
Why, if you were Merkel or Juncker, why would you make concessions at this stage when you know that the PM is going to campaign? The only time you would make concessions is after a vote to leave. That's when the real bargaining
I was always of the
That's
view
how we're
that
going to get a better deal.
If I'm a Eurosceptic, I would vote to go out purely on a democratic basis. But if David Cameron genuinely did want reform, what he should have done is said, I'm going to campaign for out. And only if I get the reforms. It's been clear from word go that he was always. There was never any scenario in which David Cameron was going to campaign to go out.
This referendum, like the referendum in 1975, when Harold Wilson came back with actually potentially even less than what David Cameron's coming back with.
That's a toss-up, that.
I understand. No, potentially, I said. But the referendum, I was involved in that referendum. It was not fought on what Harold Wilson had brought back. And this one won't be fought on what David Cameron brings back, whatever it is.
Yeah, and this one isn't going to get a 2-1 majority in either side, but certainly back staying. It'll be a lot closer. It will come down to the principle, whether you feel more prosperous, more secure within, or whether you want to be without.
And if that's the case, isn't the danger for those who want to stay in, who like people like yourself who want our country to remain part of the European Union, that there will be potentially a horrific backdrop to this referendum, an escalating, out of control migration crisis with governments doing their own thing, Hungary putting up fences, the bridge closing, Hollande and Merkel not even to agree any policy, the quota refugee policy in chaos meant to cover 160,000, so far 415 have been covered by it. That's the danger, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the refugee and migrant crisis within Schengen, which after all Britain isn't a part of, is a really major existential crisis for the EU. But the question that I hope that people put to the front of their minds when they're voting is, would us leaving make any impact on that? And I would argue that it wouldn't, because this is essentially a Schengen issue. It's not a UK.
But the key thing, the difference between 75 and now is 75 people were voting about what they wanted going forward, and they were signing up to a free trade agreement. What we're voting on this time round, hopefully as soon as June, is whether we've agreed with all of the powers that have been handed over by our democratically elected representatives. They've handed over powers to a foreign body without our permission, without our authorisation, and we're saying we'd like them back. I agree with Daniel. I think it's absolutely absurd that our Prime Minister is going around with a begging bowl saying, please, can we control our own borders?
Never mind the migration issue, right? On the euro, we know that we're going to be dragged into more bailouts. They've made that pretty clear if we stay.
But
there's the question of social... So we don't want don't want an emergency
negotiating-
brake. We want to grab the steering wheel back before we hit that car
But we
crash.
weren't. But Daniel, we weren't in the previous bailout. They gave us guarantees that we weren't involved in that.
They gave
And
us
part of the-
guarantees. They gave us guarantees in written form, in the clearest language that lawyers could devise, that we would not again be required to bail out the euro. That was a centrepiece of the Prime Minister's election campaign. And in June, we were dragged into the third
And
Greek
given
bailout,
financial-
despite all of the
and-
promises. And that's why there is a greater risk involved in
All right,
staying. There is a whole world out there. Every continent is growing except Antarctica and Europe. And we are a global nation.
viewers will be relishing the fact that they've got months of this. I can just hear the set click, click, click. Before we go, what's your best bet when the referendum is going to be?
June, because the opinion polls are moving towards exit, and because every day
Of the
that
migrant
passes,
crisis.
every day that passes is not just a worsening migration crisis. There is another risk of a spreading of the
Okay,
eurozone crisis
so
to
go.
France, and that would
When
make
do you
Greece look
think
like a
it will be?
sideshow.
I think it will be June as well. There seems to be a huge amount of
June
pressure.
23rd?
If we can get the deal in time.